and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who would like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my colleague and podcast co-host Helen Leathers. Today is going to be our second look at issues that might come up in the coaching room. So what are we going to be talking about today, Helen?
Well, Tom, this is something that we want to discuss, but also some listeners have actually written in and said, will you talk about this? It's a very common topic, both in coaching clients, but I think in people in general, and it is imposter syndrome.
Yes, I like a good discussion. I think it's a really rich topic to discuss, and I think there are lots of nuances to it. So I think we're going to have a good chat about this today. So thinking about imposter syndrome in the coaching room, how does it actually show up when you're coaching your clients?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to recognise that some people will come to coaching and say, I have imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And so that's really obvious.
No, I know I have that myself. People do say, well, I've got, and sometimes it's not, I've got a bit of imposter syndrome around that.
Yeah. Yes. Or my imposter syndrome kicked in, or something like that. So there's sometimes a very obvious understanding that might be something that a person is struggling with.
But it occurs to me that people don't come saying, oh, I have imposter syndrome, as though it's a lifelong condition that they can't escape. That they're just, in that moment, in that context, I had a bit of imposter syndrome.
Yes, absolutely. But there are other things that can be spoken about by a client. They can bring to the coaching room where we might recognise it as being one of the side effects of imposter syndrome, one of the things that are identified as being part of this experience. So if someone is coming up saying, I feel like everyone else is better than me, or I don't want to step out and be seen, I want to hide, don't always do my best work. Even procrastination can actually be indicative of imposter syndrome, because if someone is putting off doing something because they don't want to put themselves out there, it could be as a result of feeling of being an imposter.
Okay, so we're getting into a few examples of it. So let's roll back a little bit, just define imposter syndrome. So when we talk about imposter syndrome, what are we actually talking about?
Well, the very first research paper on imposter syndrome was done in the 1970s, and the paper was published in 1978 by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, and it was called The Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women. And they describe it very simply as an internal experience of intellectual phoniness.
Okay, so they were calling it imposter phenomenon at that time?
Yes, they were at that time.
Bit trickier to say than syndrome, so maybe that's why we ended up with syndrome. Okay, but also talked about an experience. Yes,
so even Pauline Clance, when she was interviewed by Amy Cuddy for one of her books, said that she wished they hadn't called it imposter phenomenon. She didn't say it was because it was hard to pronounce, but that might have been part of it. But she did say, it's not a syndrome, it's not a mental health condition. It's an experience that we all have some knowledge of at some point in our lives. So she preferred the term imposter experience. And I think that's more helpful because that is fleeting, isn't it? It's in that moment. And it means you don't have this label that then you feel you're stuck with in every moment of your life and every role that you have within your life. So I think definitely that's worth considering, that it is an experience and that everyone has it.
Yeah, and I think I know, many people that come to the coaching room who are very successful people, but there are still contexts in which they would feel like an imposter. So I had a client who ran an advertising agency. He was the creative director of an advertising agency, very successful London agency. They eventually sold out for millions, he made his fortune. But I remember him talking to me and saying, I really don't feel like I belong in the boardroom. We have to have board meetings with our venture capital people. And I don't know anything about business. But he was the main creative director. All the creative input came from him. But he still felt like he didn't own his place in the boardroom.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, intellectual phoniness, when they did this research paper, they were academics in an academic environment, and they noticed these elements in many of the high achieving women within that academic environment. So it was very much focused on academia. But when they've done further research, we've found that the imposter experience, it's a joy because it does not discriminate. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. It doesn't matter whether you're white and Western or from any other cultural background. It doesn't matter what role you do in the world or what qualifications you have or don't have. It will find you. And everyone seems to experience it.
Yeah, although I would say I think if you are in perhaps a male-dominated world and you show up as a woman, then you might have that sense of, well, I don't feel like I belong because I'm not made to feel welcome.
Exactly. And equally, if you were walking to a white environment and you're not white, then you're going to feel different already. And that's very much part of the process that we can work through to look at how to deal with our feelings around this experience.
And then we have that idea of intersectionality, where if you've got more than one thing that's different, then that becomes even worse. That becomes even more exaggerated, that feeling of not belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, the interesting thing is, and Valerie Young, who has written an amazing book on imposter experiences, she believes from studies she's done that there's a 70 to 84% chance your coaching clients experience imposter syndrome. And that compares with about 70% of the population. So a high chance that people coming to you for coaching will have had this experience at some point, and therefore quite useful to know how to approach it with a client.
Okay, so that's interesting. So why does she suggest that the percentage is higher than normal for people coming to coaching?
It may well be because they've got the opportunity to talk about it, which in other circumstances they haven't, because what imposter syndrome loves is isolating you and creating this feeling of it's just me, and that sense of loneliness and not being able to talk about it. And one of the things that is really important is that we find other people who are having a similar experience. And actually, it's really easy to do. I did a talk fairly recently where I asked some questions which were about, do you experience these things, which were all part of the imposter syndrome? And literally every woman in the room, it was a women's organisation, put their hand up, and every single one of them, not just for one of these things that I mentioned, but the majority of them for every single one of these things that I mentioned. And the overriding thing that I heard being said in that room at that time was, I thought it was just me. And it's not, So if we can talk to people, and if we can bring it to the coaching room, find that we're not alone, then we have to really ask the question, is it that I'm not good enough? Is it that I'm a fraud? Or is it, because all of these other people are experiencing it too, my thinking around this, and perhaps some other things coming in from society, the culture, the organisation, the relationships, but is there something within my thinking that is flawed? And if there is, that's something we can address, right? So it means it's not so much of a problem.
Yeah, and I think you talk about finding other people that have experienced it. I think every coach that has ever learnt to coach has felt like an imposter at some point. Perhaps come across a new client with a new situation and think, I don't know how to coach around that. That's never come up before. So I think, coaches are definitely, so for a start, we're non-judgmental. So we're not going to judge someone for saying those things out loud, but also we will recognise it in ourselves as well.
Yes, I know that when I first went to a workshop that you ran, actually, and all of the other coaches were talking about the GROW model, and I was never taught the GROW model when I did my coach training. And I felt such a fraud. I knew absolutely that my coaching was transformational for the women I worked with. But in that room of all these coaches who knew this acronym, and I was thinking, I haven't got a clue. I don't know. And so there was a real challenge for me around that, and feeling like a bit of an imposter there.
Yeah. And as we explored on our last podcast, grow model's flawed anyway, so maybe it was good that you didn't learn it. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Very good. So let's think about some of the elements that might come up within imposter syndrome. So we've said that some people will just come and say, yeah, that's a bit of imposter syndrome kicking in, but other people might come with different ways of talking about what they're experiencing. So what are some of the elements that feed into imposter syndrome?
I'm glad you asked, because I have a list.
Oh,
are you ready?
Very exciting. Tell me, what's on your list?
So I'm going to whiz through these. We've got overthinking, second guessing, not owning our own accomplishments, and often crediting external sources for our success. Oh, it was just luck. Oh, it was just timing. And perhaps in some circumstances, they just needed another woman on the board to, look good, or that kind of thing, this external force, rather than our own achievements and success. There's also an element of fixation on how we think other people are judging us and how those impacts will affect us, when in most cases, people aren't judging us in the way that we think at all.
No, there's an interesting unconscious bias that is recognised as the spotlight bias, where we think people are thinking about us when actually they don't really care. They're not giving us a second thought.
They're too worried about worrying about what people think of them at that moment in time. So we can learn a lot from that concept. A worry about being underprepared, which often results in over-preparation, procrastination, holding back, keeping a low profile, obsessing about what we should be doing, rumination. That's a good one. Oh, I should have said this. I should have done that, playing out that thing that just happened in our mind in different scenarios. Discounting the importance of what we've done. Oh, it was nothing. It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same. Not being able to accept praise is a big one as well. And I think this is really important. If someone gives us praise, I often say it's like receiving a gift. And if someone went to the time and effort to buy you a gift and wrap it and present it to you, would you take one look and go, no thanks?
Depends. Might be socks. If it was socks, maybe.
But for the most part.
I get a lot of socks.
Oh, thanks. I've bought you socks.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Note to self, look more grateful when receiving socks.
And when someone gives you praise, treat it like a gift and say thank you, because that will really help you to start to, even if it feels weird at first, start to actually help you to feel less of a fraud.
No, that is good, actually. I think particularly the British, we're not particularly good at accepting praise and compliments, are we? We do tend to be very dismissive of that sort of affirmation.
Yes, absolutely. We've got a doubt in our abilities, thinking our past accomplishments were a fluke, thinking other people are more intelligent or more capable than us, underestimating our success, exaggerating our failures, and also self-sabotaging.
There was a long list in the end, wasn't there?
Yes, good. I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a long list. And what was occurring to me as you were reading through it is that there's a lot of crossover between these symptoms of imposter experience and the world of cognitive behavioural coaching, which is all about what's going on in our heads. We're not actually quite often dealing with reality. We're dealing just with that inner voice that's telling us something. So that's a really interesting, for me, a really interesting element of imposter experience, that there might be some unhelpful thinking patterns going on that are particularly worth exploring in the coaching room.
Absolutely. And I think a cognitive behavioural approach is one that will really suit working with imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon, the imposter experience, whatever you'd like to call it. So yes, and much of what I do is based with imposter syndrome is based on that idea of challenging that thinking and finding a new way and trying it out and seeing what happens.
Which is a very cognitive behavioural approach. So let's think in a bit more detail about that then. So let's imagine someone is coming to you and it isn't just, oh yeah, there was a bit of imposter syndrome going on there, but I'm fine. It is more of a, I really can't do this because I am not worthy, I am not good enough. I can't possibly put my head above the because it will get shot down. How are you going to work with someone in that situation?
Well, I think, first of all, it's really important to explore the reality of the situation. And if there's a reason that could be contributing to those feelings, and we mentioned it before about whether it's a societal, cultural, or organisational, or even sometimes relationship-based issue that perhaps needs to be looked at, first of all, recognised, and then maybe challenged or addressed. It could be that someone is making the best effort possible to contribute to your feeling of not fitting in, maybe not inviting you to certain meetings, for example, or maybe just the dynamics of the organisation, the culture of the organisation that's always been a particular way, doesn't invite you to be part of it. So I think that's really important to explore.
Yeah, and I guess if you were thinking around those elements of it, if it's the context, if it's the culture of the organisation, and you don't feel like you belong, maybe there's some information there for you about your own values and how your values align with the values of an organisation. And maybe you don't fit. Maybe your values are better suited to a different environment. So I think that initially there's that. Am I a good fit for the organisation? Because I'm not sure it's an organisation I want to belong to. It's that old Groucho Marx saying, isn't it? I don't want to belong to any club that would have me as a member. So, but I think it is useful to think about that. And I've certainly had coaches come in the past where their values have been clashing against the culture that exists, the values of the behaviours that are going on within an organisation. They might have values that are talked about, but the way they go about their work lives, they're not demonstrating those values. So I think that's a really good question to ask. But that would probably suggest it's not imposter experience, but just not a good fit for their own values.
Yeah, or it could be that it feeds into something that's already existing within you.
Okay, so that feeling of not... do you know, I think a lot of this stems from school, doesn't it? You know, we all want to fit in at school, and very rarely do any of us feel like we do fit in. We always feel like everyone else is having a better time and making friends, and we just a bit on the outside. So I think that may be where we first start to encounter imposter experience, that not fitting in.
Quite possibly.
And I think sometimes it's possible to put ourselves in situations where we know we're not going to fit in. It's like, I've certainly had a coach recently who talked about imposter experience, or imposter syndrome as she called it. But when we looked at her river of life, she'd frequently put herself in situations where she was the outsider. And knew that she'd done that of her own volition, no one was making her do that, but an interesting area to explore for her, and some real sort of self-realisation there of what was going on for her.
Yeah. So that's the first reality check there, is to look at all of the other things that are going on. But the second one is, and it sounds a bit mean, but, you know, should you feel like an imposter? Because if you're new at something and you've never been in that role or been in that type of organisation before, then perhaps you should feel like an imposter. Perhaps you should, and maybe feeling like an imposter is too harsh, but that role is new. And I worked with a client who was very experienced in what she did, but she went into a new sector. So instead of being in the private sector, she was in the charitable sector, and she'd never worked in that sector before. So while she knew what to do in her role, she didn't know how to work within that sector and that environment. And so we had some conversations around how that contributed to her feeling like an imposter, when actually she just needed to get some new information.
Yeah, and actually that's a choice she's making, isn't it? To go into a new sector where she knows she's going to feel out of place to start with. So yes. In order to challenge ourselves and push at those boundaries of our own experience and our own skill set, we're going to have to put ourselves into situations where we feel uncomfortable. And it's that getting comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, I think that's the secret there, isn't it? But I don't think it's particularly helped by the sort of terminology, the metaphors we use around this sort of thing. So quite often we'll say, oh, it was a baptism of fire, because you're suddenly in a situation where there's lots going on. And you think about the COVID pandemic, if you were a new manager in that environment, no one knew what was happening. No one knew how to deal with it. But that would be a baptism of fire. Maybe being a fish out of water. There are expressions that make it sound really uncomfortable. So I think some of it is around the language we use as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I can only imagine how challenging and scary it must feel as a new doctor on a ward doing their first ward round and feeling that all of the knowledge they have in their head, somehow they've got to, access as required. That must be so scary. But if you're new to it, it's okay for it to be scary. In fact, if they were not scared, if they were flippant, it will be fine about it, that's almost more worrying, isn't it, really?
And so if they were overconfident, then
yes,
it could be dangerous.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that brings into it another element, which is in feeling that imposter experience, that we can feel isolated, we can shut down and not talk to people, where actually, if we're new and we need some support, it would be good for us to be reaching out and asking for help and saying, I'm not sure about this, can you just support me in this? But that's not what we tend to do. We tend to hide ourselves away, hide that feeling of inexperience and a lack of competence, tend to shut it away.
Yeah, and instead of remembering that everybody's been new at something.
Yeah, and if you think about it, obviously apprentices are something that's had a resurgence in recent years. And the whole idea of an apprentice working with a master, a tradesperson, was that you got some experience and you got the benefit of their wisdom and you worked under them and no one expected you to know what you were doing, that you were there to learn. So I think some of that approach of recognizing that if you are there at the beginning, no one is expecting you to know it all and to be really good at it. You've got to give it some time. So both of us are involved in dancing. And as a male turning up to dance at a venue, quite often I'm leading the dance. That's the nature of partner dancing. We both do something called modern jive. And when I'm dancing, I tend to turn up after the lesson. So there will be some new people that have just done a lesson. They might have only learned 3 moves in the lesson. And I will ask them to dance. And they will say, oh, yeah, but I'm rubbish. It's my first night. I say, well, you're not rubbish. You're just at the beginning. And it will be fine. And I whiz them around the room and it's fine. But there's no way that I would expect them to be able to perform really complex moves because they're at the beginning. And I think it's the same in most organisations. I think one of the things that I come across frequently is people being put in a position where they're almost set up to fail, not necessarily intentionally, but new managers, for example, quite often are put into a management role because they're good at what they do. So that might be engineering, or you're a great engineer, we'll give you other engineers to manage. We're not going to train you. We know you don't have any experience, but we're going to do it anyway. And I think sometimes that's where people can come a little bit unstuck and feel like an imposter because they don't have experience and they don't have training and no one's really prepared to give them that training.
So it's really important that we explore all of the things that are contributing to the feelings of being an imposter. And, is it just that you're new? In research, it's shown that students identify really highly with imposter syndrome. And I think I can identify with that because having done a degree later in life, I felt like, I meant to know this. But of course, as you regularly reminded me, I'm not meant to know this because that's why I'm studying. And so we can get those feelings and those expectations of succeeding, we can get them all muddled in our own head. So really important explorations to have.
Yeah, I had a manager recently who was fairly new to management. She'd been in post about 6 months when she came to coaching and had 20 people to manage, 2 different departments, 20 people in total. And prior to that, she'd only ever had 1 person to manage, a very small team, her and an assistant. And she was saying, I just feel like an imposter because I look at my director and he just knows the answers and he can just tell me what to do. And he just knows everything. And I want to be like that. And I think that's great from an aspirational perspective. Okay, there's someone that I can look to as a role model. I can work towards being that. But there's no way she could be that in that moment. She doesn't have the experience, doesn't have the knowledge. And there's a path. It's that I want to be there, but I'm not there yet is a great way to think about it and to be on that journey. But thinking that you can take a shortcut and suddenly have the knowledge and the experience at the flick of a switch is not going to happen. So again, it's back to that reality. What's going on in your head, and how real is that? Because if your expectation is that you're going to walk into a new role and expect to know everything and call on experience you don't have, then that's unrealistic thinking, isn't it?
Yeah. So once we've done all that exploration around reality and what could be feeding into it and what do we need to challenge, there are a number of different ways that we can address it in the coaching room.
Tell us some of them, Helen.
So we definitely need to think about our behaviours as a result of imposter syndrome and what the consequences of those behaviours are, which again comes back to that cognitive behavioural approach, which I'm sure we'll explore in more detail on a future podcast. And some of those behaviours could include procrastinating and perfectionism, because, if we procrastinate and don't complete something, then we can't be judged on it. If we are perfectionists, we want it to be 100% perfect, and nothing is ever 100% perfect. Often people who are perfectionists feel that, 99% perfect is 100% of a fail. And we need to look at that and look at the consequences as a result of all of those things, and then explore how we could perhaps reframe that thinking. And changing our physiology and our state can also help. And we can often get one to change the other. So our physiology can change the way we feel, and therefore the way we think, and therefore the way we behave. And I've said before that I love to use embodiment work, and this is something that we can use to help with imposter syndrome. Whether it's listening to empowering music before we go into a scenario where we might feel uncomfortable, or we might feel that we don't know it all, using postural embodiment work to feel more confident, anything basically that helps us to feel powerful, to show up in a more confident way, to show up in a full version of ourselves rather than a lesser version. I think that's what imposter syndrome does, is it diminishes us. And what we need to do is kind of go, no, I'm not going to be diminished. I'm not going to be less than. I'm going to step into and own this space. And if I need to ask questions, I need to ask questions. If I need to explore and find out more, I need to do that. When we show up differently, we're treated differently. So exploring all of that, and then also exploring and experimenting with how we think differently, little tweaks on how we behave, as well as that change of state. All of these can really help, and we can coach someone through scenarios where they could try these things and then perhaps come back to the coaching room and we could talk about how things were different as a result of this. And I've worked with a client who used this to great effect. Someone who worked in a very male-dominated society. She was also a very small lady in stature. She was tiny, and she would, by her own admission, kind of sink into the background, make herself invisible in head of department meetings. And she just did something really small to start with, which was to squeeze her shoulders back to bring her posture into a slightly different, more confident way of being. And she said it changed how she felt in that room. It changed how she interacted with the other heads of department, and it changed how she felt she was perceived and then treated in that environment. And it made all the difference. So it's really about how we feel about ourselves. It's definitely not about going out and getting more qualifications and avoiding the issue, but it's about how we perceive ourselves, and then how we get treated by others can all help to combat those feelings of imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And I certainly resonate with that. I say it's not just women that feel this. I had a gentleman recently who was on a board of directors. He was very much the technical side of the business, wasn't a businessman in his head. He just knew the technical stuff. So was really struggling in board meetings. So one of the things that we worked with him on was how he wanted to be in those board meetings. And he said, well, I want to be like a king. I want to turn up and listen to my advisors and then make a decision based on their advice, but it would be my decision. So I asked him who he could bring to mind as that kingly figure, and he brought to mind a Game of Thrones character. And I don't know Game of Thrones, so I have no idea who he was. But he brought him to mind. And I said, okay, so if he was entering that meeting, how would he show up? And he threw his shoulders back and he puffed his chest out and just became someone different. Right before my eyes, he just became a different person. And he had a conversation. Well, the first thing he did was send an email out saying, this is how the next meeting is going to work. But it was just that initial seeing himself as someone different rather than this person that showed up and didn't say anything. So I think it can be really powerful, just as you say, talking about physiology and changing something that makes other people see you differently. You go, oh, this is different. How am I going to respond to this?
Yeah, and that can all help to change our thinking around the situation. And as a result, about how we feel about ourselves.
Yeah. So back to that cognitive behavioural approach, physiology connected to emotions, connected to cognition, and to the behaviours that we demonstrate.
Absolutely.
Good. So I think that's been quite a thorough exploration of imposter syndrome. I'm sure there are other elements that we could have explored.
Talk all day.
Yeah. So let's think about that as imposter experience. And I think for me that's quite often how it shows up, that it's not necessarily, oh, I have imposter syndrome, my life is over. It's more of a, okay, well, I had this experience in this context, which is strange, but I did feel a bit like an imposter and I kind of felt like I didn't belong, and I don't want to feel like that. And how can I go about feeling differently? So and that's what we're going to explore with our coachees, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Good. So thank you for that, Helen. I've really enjoyed that. That's
You're welcome.
An interesting topic. We will have more topics that people might bring to coaching in future episodes, so keep your eye out for those. If you'd care to subscribe to our podcast, please do that, and then you won't miss any episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, feel free to share it with other doctors that are interested in coaching, or just coaches in general. I think it's of interest to most coaches. So we look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you, Helen. Thank you for now.
You're very welcome. Next time we're going to be answering some of our listeners' questions, so I'm really looking forward to that.
We love a Q&A, so yes. Excellent stuff. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.